In the fall of 1982, 7 people in the Chicago metropolitan area died within 4 days of each other. They were not connected by geography in any obvious way. They were not connected by lifestyle, by age, by profession, or by any personal relationship to each other. What connected them was a single, completely routine act that millions of Americans performed every day without a second thought. They opened a bottle of Tylenol and took 1 capsule for a headache, a cold, or general pain relief, and they were dead within hours. Someone had gotten there first. Someone had walked into multiple pharmacies and grocery stores across the Chicago area, removed bottles of extra-strength Tylenol from the shelves, opened them, replaced the medicine inside the capsules with potassium cyanide, a compound lethal in a dose small enough to fit inside a single capsule, resealed the bottles, and placed them back on the shelves, quietly, casually, without anyone noticing. And then they walked out, and apparently waited. 43 years later, that person has never been identified. No one has ever been charged. No one has ever been convicted. And the tamper-evident seals now found on every single medicine bottle sold anywhere in the United States exist entirely because of what happened in Chicago during those 4 days in September 1982. The first victim was Mary Kellerman, 12 years old, a 7th grader from Elk Grove Village, Illinois. On the morning of September 29, 1982, she woke up with symptoms of a cold, a sore throat, a runny nose, and her parents gave her a single extra-strength Tylenol capsule before she headed to the bathroom. She collapsed on the bathroom floor within the hour. Her parents called emergency services and she was pronounced dead at a local hospital that same morning. The initial cause was unclear. Nobody immediately suspected poison. That same day, within hours of each other, 3 more people in different parts of the Chicago area died under strikingly similar circumstances. Adam Janus, a 27-year-old postal worker from Arlington Heights, died after taking Tylenol at home for chest pain. His death prompted 2 family members to come to his house to grieve. His younger brother, Stanley Janus, and Stanley's wife, Teresa Janus, recently married, who also took capsules from the same bottle Adam had left behind while they were at the house dealing with the shock of his death. Both Stanley and Teresa died within days. Mary McFarland, 31 years old, died after taking Tylenol at her workplace. Mary Reiner, 27 years old, recently home from the hospital after giving birth to her 4th child, died at home after taking Tylenol for postpartum discomfort. Paula Prince, 35 years old, a flight attendant, was found dead in her Chicago apartment, a Tylenol bottle on the bathroom counter beside her. 7 deaths, 4 days. Multiple locations across the Chicago area. Each victim connected by nothing more than a routine purchase from a store shelf. The connection between the deaths was not immediately apparent to the medical professionals who encountered the first cases, since cyanide poisoning, while relatively fast-acting, can initially present with symptoms that could be attributed to other causes. It was only through a combination of a sharp-eyed medical examiner, communication between different local hospitals and health departments, and a tip from off-duty firefighters who'd begun hearing about multiple sudden deaths and became suspicious, that investigators were able to connect the cases and determine, through toxicology, that cyanide poisoning was the common thread. Once the connection was established, the response was extraordinary in scale and speed. Chicago police drove through neighborhoods using loudspeakers to warn residents not to take Tylenol. Local television and radio stations broadcast emergency alerts. Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of Tylenol's manufacturer McNeil Consumer Products, immediately and voluntarily recalled every single bottle of extra-strength Tylenol on the market nationally, approximately 31 million bottles, worth an estimated $100 million at the time, without being ordered to do so by any government authority. This recall decision, made proactively and under enormous financial pressure, is now widely studied in business and crisis management courses as one of the most effective corporate crisis responses in American commercial history. a case of a company prioritizing public safety over profit at a moment when the temptation to minimize the incident must have been enormous. FBI and FDA investigators moved quickly to analyze the recovered bottles and map the contamination. What they found was both clarifying and deeply troubling. The tampered bottles had been purchased from at least 6 different stores across the Chicago area, some of them miles apart, suggesting the poisoner had traveled deliberately to multiple locations to distribute the tampered product, rather than simply altering a single batch. This confirmed almost immediately that whatever had happened was not a manufacturing contamination at the factory level. It was retail-level tampering, carried out by someone physically present in those stores. The cyanide itself, investigators determined, was not consistent with any formulation used in Johnson & Johnson's manufacturing process, further confirming it had been introduced after the product left the factory. The investigation that followed was one of the largest the FBI and FDA had ever conducted at that point. Hundreds of agents were deployed. Tips poured in from across the country. Investigators examined security footage from the stores involved, though video surveillance technology in 1982 was far less comprehensive than it is today, and the footage available was, in most cases, insufficient for clear identification. Every employee of every store where tampered bottles were recovered was interviewed. Former Johnson & Johnson employees were investigated. Individuals with documented knowledge of cyanide compounds, including industrial workers, laboratory technicians, and certain manufacturing sector employees, were looked at. One man emerged early as a significant suspect and has remained the most publicly scrutinized person connected to the case for decades since. James William Lewis, a Kansas City man who sent an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson in October 1982, just weeks after the deaths, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. Lewis was located and arrested and ultimately convicted and imprisoned, not for the murders themselves, since investigators were never able to place him in the Chicago area at the time or connect him physically to the tampered bottles, but for the extortion letter alone. He served approximately 13 years in federal prison for the extortion conviction. Lewis consistently denied any involvement in the actual poisonings until his death in 2023, and while he remained in the public imagination and in some investigative circles the most frequently named person of interest, the FBI has never formally and publicly declared him the confirmed perpetrator of the murders themselves, and no physical evidence has ever been presented publicly that definitively places him as the person who tampered with those bottles. Over the decades, the FBI periodically revisited the case as forensic techniques improved. DNA technology was applied to evidence from the original investigation at various points, though its precise application and results were not fully disclosed publicly. In 2009 and again in subsequent years, investigators searched properties associated with James Lewis and reportedly recovered materials that renewed investigative interest. Lewis, who died in 2023, maintained his denial of involvement in the killings until the end. Beyond the Lewis investigation, the case has generated a persistent, broader question that investigators have never definitively answered. Was this the act of a single individual with a specific grievance, or was it someone who simply wanted to cause indiscriminate, anonymous harm, with no identifiable motive connecting them to any of the victims? All 7 victims appear to have been completely random. Nobody killed by the tampered Tylenol had any documented connection to each other, to James Lewis, or to anyone else who's ever been named in connection with the investigation. This randomness is, in some ways, the most psychologically disturbing element of the case and one of the factors that makes it uniquely resistant to conventional investigative logic, since most homicide investigation begins with the relationship between killer and victim, and here there was apparently none. The aftermath of the case reshaped American consumer culture in ways that are so embedded in daily life today that most people never think about them. The FDA moved quickly to mandate what became known as tamper-evident packaging standards for all over-the-counter medicines, effective from 1983 onward. The triple seal design still found on virtually every bottle of medicine sold in the United States. The outer shrink wrap, the foil seal under the cap, and the cotton or paper insert exists entirely because of those 7 deaths in Chicago in 1982. Before 1982, none of that existed. Bottles of Tylenol, aspirin, and every other over-the-counter medicine sat on pharmacy shelves in packaging that could be opened and resealed without leaving any trace that it had been tampered with. Congress also passed what became known as the Federal Anti-Tampering Act in 1983, making the tampering with consumer products a federal crime carrying serious penalties, legislation that had not previously existed and that was drafted directly in response to what happened in Chicago. Johnson & Johnson, facing what many business analysts expected to be a potentially fatal blow to the Tylenol brand, instead rebuilt consumer trust through a transparent safety-first response strategy that became a case study in crisis management, and eventually reintroduced Tylenol to the market in the new tamper-evident packaging in November 1982, less than 2 months after the deaths. The brand recovered. But the 7 people who died never got that recovery. Mary Kellerman was 12 years old. Adam Janus was 27. Stanley and Teresa Janus were newlyweds. Mary McFarland was 31. Mary Reiner had just come home with a new baby. Paula Prince had just landed at O'Hare Airport after a flight and stopped at a store on her way home. The person who placed those bottles back on those shelves in September 1982 has never been charged, has never been publicly confirmed, and may still be alive today. The FBI technically lists the case as open. Whether it will ever be solved at this point is a question that grows harder to answer with every year that passes. Subscribe, because next time, we're covering a case from 1961 where a woman checked into a Paris hotel alone, left her room without any of her belongings, and was never seen again. A disappearance that exposed one of the most complicated criminal investigations the French government has ever tried to keep secret.